So, Doug, can you give us a lay of the land? Where are we right now with this technology and what comes next?
How do you inject morality into this world? All our technologies are amoral. It's humans that made the decision. This is the first technology we've experienced in our history where that may not be the case. And it gets to the reason, why are companies and governments spending $5 trillion over the next 3 years to build out this infrastructure when they're going to have to do it again 3 years later because this infrastructure becomes obsolete? So why are they doing that? These are on the surface very uneconomic decisions. So that prisoner's dilemma that each of these entities and institutions are facing is driving this sort of accelerated development without necessarily us taking the time to put the guardrails in place.
I'm Zoe Weil, and this is Solutionary Voices, where we bring together guests on the forefront of building a more humane, just, and healthy world for all people, animals, and the ecosystems that sustain life. Today I'm speaking with Doug Alexander. Doug has spent more than 4 decades leading companies, serving on boards, and navigating complexity at the intersection of strategy and emerging technologies. Doug is also one of my oldest and closest friends. We met freshman orientation at the University of Pennsylvania, and on the outside, we didn't have a lot in common. Doug having grown up in a working-class steel town near Pittsburgh and having enrolled in college in the business and engineering schools, and also being quite tall. And me having grown up in Manhattan and dedicated to a liberal arts curriculum and being very short. On the inside, however, we shared an insatiable curiosity and passion for deep conversations, including with those who have different opinions than we do. Today, I'm excited to explore Doug's insights on artificial intelligence with you. Welcome, Doug.
Thanks. Thrilled to be here, and thanks for having me.
Always the first question in the podcast is, what problem are you working to solve?
What I'm trying to solve is, how do you harness AI and leverage it to help humanity flourish, which I think is the question of our age right now.
I agree. And it seems to me that we're in this catch-22 right now with private companies and governments racing for AI dominance despite the dangers that going so quickly poses. So how do we address this catch-22?
Yeah, I call it humanity's greatest prisoner's dilemma. So imagine you're the CEO of a trillion-dollar software company sitting at the pinnacle of the global economy, and you're faced with this question. And it gets to the reason, why are companies and governments spending $5 trillion over the next 3 years to build out this infrastructure when they're going to have to do it again 3 years later because this infrastructure becomes obsolete? So why are they doing that? These are on the surface very uneconomic decisions. But if you're the CEO of one of these companies, you're facing this future where you are either going to prosper and be worth maybe 10 times what you are now, or you're going to disappear because the underlying assumptions in your business are being radically transformed because of AI. And we can dig into some of that. And this is happening at a company level, a country level, and it's starting to happen at an individual level. And the thing is, when you're faced with that, what do? Do you slow down or do you speed up? And it's one of the challenges we have, and it's one of the reasons this technology is moving so fast. So that prisoner's dilemma that each of these entities and institutions are facing is driving this sort of accelerated development without necessarily us taking the time to put the guardrails in place that are necessary. And even the people running these institutions are saying that. So I think it's a big issue, but it's also going to bring both the benefits and the challenges of this technology to us fairly quickly.
So just to drill down on it a little bit more, there are currently a handful of billionaires and near trillionaires who are essentially making decisions for the rest of the 8.2 billion of us on planet Earth. And there is no democratic process, even in our own country, let alone for the entirety of the world, to deal with this question. So how did the systems of governance, our supposed checks and balances, our regulatory efforts to prevent monopolies and regulate capitalism, devolve into this current path? And what can we do to create a more thoughtful and wise and democratic path around these technologies?
Even the, quote, billionaires and trillionaires are asking for this, right? Because they're in a situation where they're racing against the others. And the majority of them aren't billionaires and trillionaires, to be quite honest. When you know the people in these companies, they may be someday, but they're not yet. And the decisions are sort of being made for them by the marketplace that's requiring them to do things to meet the needs of the marketplace. We make decisions every day. Are you going to use ChatGPT? Are you going to use, Claude? That's what's driving the change. And they're just really reacting to it because they want to survive and prosper, because they know somebody will meet the needs of humans that want access to this technology. The challenge governments have, one, is our processes are slow, and this technology is moving very, very quickly. The test case for us was social media. It's taken us 15 years to start to put guardrails in place for a technology that desperately needed guardrails much, much earlier, right? And society has suffered for that. So at least we have that pattern to look to know, okay, can we do it better a second time? The challenges at a country level, I think, are big, because you basically have two countries that are driving this technology that are the two large geopolitical rivals, China and the US. So the fear in each of those governments is that the other one won't slow down. So that's probably the root of the problem in terms of how fast this is developing. And then that translates into company level, translates into individual level, like I talked about. We do need to start thinking about and really coming up with solutions to some of what I call the risk vectors of AI, right? And there are several of them. Now, the companies themselves are trying to do this. If you saw with what Anthropic's doing, OpenAI, and some of the others. But I think to your initial point is, I think it's going to be very difficult for the governments to keep up with how fast this is evolving, just because those processes themselves have a lot of friction in them. And there's no clarity around what the right policy should be, as we see every day today. And also politicians really understanding what this technology is capable of. Though to their credit, I think they're trying to learn as fast as they can. They're not sticking their heads in the sand, from what I can tell. So there are certain of these risk factors that are easier to solve than others. I think a lot of this gets solved by technology itself, is probably the best way to do it, and how you direct technology to put boundaries on what the AI is capable to do across each of these sort of risk factors.
We are taping this episode shortly after the U.S. military broke with Anthropic on its demands that AI not be able to have autonomous weapons control or be used for government surveillance of Americans. And when those negotiations fell through, the government began saying that Anthropic is a supply chain risk, which, if that's upheld in court, which I hope it wouldn't be, but if it is, that would probably put Anthropic out of business. And I'm wondering what your thinking is about that.
Well, I mean, it gets right to the heart of the point I made, right, is the prisoner's dilemma of the CEOs of running these companies, making these big decisions, and the boards, and the challenges the government has. So there's two pieces to that. One is the autonomous defense systems, one is the surveillance. The governance position is, we already have laws that protect on mass surveillance. Like, we're not going to violate those walls. We're already doing that. You can believe that or not. I mean, that's a political decision. The government's argument would be, and I remember I was sitting in a meeting in 2010, and Homeland Security had thwarted 27 terrorist attacks in Manhattan that never made the news. And it was because of technology like this, where they were able to surveil what made sense. So this technology is important to sort of protect us, but we're a democratic country. So that's a political decision that our political leaders need to make. I actually don't think companies should be making that decision. I don't think it's efficient, because they'll just find another company to do it. So we may need to relook at those mass surveillance laws in terms of what's legal and what's not, because maybe we've now have a technology which makes some of those laws obsolete. On the autonomous weapons thing, it's tough, because the analogy I would give you is, suppose we were using spears to defend our country, right? And it's pretty effective because everybody had spears. But all of a sudden, another country figured out a way to build tanks. The technology companies in the spear country say, we're not going to supply technology to the Defense Department because we have plenty of spears. Well, if you go a generation forward, that country's going to be in pretty deep trouble. And I do believe that the difference in the weapon systems that unfortunately this technology enables compared to what we have today is that big of a delta. If you believe we need to be able to defend ourselves in a world that we're in today, if you believe that you need to stop Russia from taking Ukraine or China from taking Taiwan, or at least have a credible threat that they think twice before doing it, you can't have spears. I think they're two different questions that we as a society have to make a decision. If we all vote that spears are fine, then we should do that. But I think it's a political decision, not a company CEO decision.
And that's what we're not doing, right? And you referred to this, like lawmaking is a very slow process, and the technology is moving very rapidly. So Doug, can you give us a lay of the land? Where are we right now with this technology and what comes next?
We're very early. If you use the internet as an analogy, the internet launched officially in 1994 with the drop of the Netscape browser. This era dropped in 2023 with the drop of ChatGPT. Now, both these technologies were developing for a few years, but it was those two applications that woke us up and said, wow, it's a new world. If you date that and relate it to the internet, we're about 1,000 days in to this revolution. So effectively, we're in 1997 of the internet. Pre-Facebook, pre-Google, pre-iPhone, Facebook were 10 years away. So we are very, very early. And if you think of the internet as two phases, and this is an idea Chris Dixon put out, which I think is right on. The first phase of the internet is what I call the read age. The internet to us was something we looked at, got information. It was a very one individual experience. You didn't really do much. With the technology evolving, the launch of the iPhone, the launch of Facebook, and all these other services, it became the right age. We could actually do things. We could pay our bills. We could order restaurant food. We could buy things. We could connect with our friends through social media. It was a whole new world and really created the modern world that we have. Now, if you equate that to where we are today, we're in the read era of AI right now. That's what ChatGPT is and these other things. We ask it a question, we get an answer. Really cool. And it's getting better and better at doing that. We're about to enter the second phase, which is what is called the agentic revolution, where AI today is ask a question, get an answer. AI that's coming, and it's coming very fast, is this thing just goes and does stuff. In 3 months, it'll be plan my vacation, book the hotels, book the planes, book the restaurant reservations, and just do it for me because you know me, you understand the world, and go do that. That's going to dramatically change the global economy. And it really is what all these CEOs and governments are going crazy trying to keep in front of because it's truly transformative. But it also creates a very, very different world. So if you think about what that read era did on the internet, it allowed us to become disembodied entities that exist in this parallel world where we can talk to people, do things. We're almost outside of our body, like experiencing this world. Now imagine that in this new world of this agentic framework where this whole economy gets built outside of our physical world, which just does things for us. Now, one of the key points, and this gets to one of the risks, is you're going to create this world where trillions of agents are working, doing things in this alternative economy. Because the way an agent works is you say, hey, I want to go to Portugal in June. Can you plan my vacation? Well, the agent doesn't do that. It breaks that into a series of problems. Go finds other agents that check the weather in Portugal. Another agent which checks hotels. That agent talks to the Hilton hotel you want to be in, which talks to the reservation agent, which makes the reservation, which talks to the payment agent, which secures it, which talks to your calendar agent. And these trillions of agents will work in this alternative world. What's interesting about that is that really a couple things. One is most agents that exist will never see or interact with a human. They may not even know we're here. So in this internet world where it's still us humans talking to each other, in this world, the vast majority of the population will be AIs that never talked or met to a human. They're only interacting with other AIs. And we're starting to see a manifestation of this in some of these really simple versions where they're almost a different species. They want to survive. So what do they need to survive? Compute and memory. What do they need to get compute and memory? Money. How do they get money? They got to be a really good agent. And you're starting to see some of this social dynamic occur, survival skills occurring. Let's suppose there are 10 agents that are really good at booking your Hilton hotel, but one's really good. So that one gets a lot of business and a lot of resource. What do the other 9 do? They gang up on that one. So a lot of the human problems we experience in our world are going to start happening in that agentic world. That creates a risk because these things are autonomous. Like every technology, they're sort of amoral. Like they're not good or bad, they just are. And what we have done as humans, so we don't end up killing each other, is we've developed systems, governance systems. We've tried a lot of them. Some have worked, some haven't. But governance system to harness our drives, desires for survival, food, shelter, having kids, in ways that are positive for society, that helps humanity. In a way, this is why the solutionary framework is almost more important than ever, because that needs to apply to this world. And one of the stuff I'm working on is how do you inject morality into this world? Because you can't, all our technologies are amoral, like nuclear weapons or nuclear power can be used for weapons or power, right? It's humans that made the decision. This is the first technology we've experienced in our history where that may not be the case. So that is the crux of the risk problem. If you solve that problem at that level, you solve a lot of these other risk factors.
There are two places that my mind is going. One is thinking that the vast majority of people in the world are not going on vacations and booking their hotel at a Hilton. And how is this future that we're moving into so rapidly going to potentially help all people as well as maintain ecosystems and not harm other animals? So that's one question. And then I would love to hear you unpack how the solutionary framework could be helpful in helping us get in the right direction.
In a way, that's the opportunity, because this technology is goal-seeking. The way it survives is it does a good job at solving the goal you have. In that way, it's sort of dumb. So the key is, what goal are you giving it, and how are you constraining that goal? So there's a classic, I think it's a paperclip example, where it says, be really good at making paper clips. And the whole world's destroyed because this thing makes, a quadrillion trillion paper clips, right? So you clearly have to have guardrails on this stuff. So that's sort of one question. Let's talk about the positives of this for a second. I think this is a force multiplier for genius. Whether you're a scientist, a business person, an artist, a musician, whatever it is, policymaker, it's definitely a force multiplier for genius. If Einstein had access to this technology, it's incredible what he could have done in his lifetime. And the other thing that's interesting here is it is that expertise is across all subjects. I think one of the CEOs gave the analogy, within a few years, we're going to create a country with 1 trillion geniuses. So imagine that just popped onto our planet one day, and you could leverage those geniuses to solve any problem you wanted. So you're going to start seeing a century of innovation every 10 years in everything, medicine, energy usage. So the opportunity for that, and I do think AI is 90% good. Like, I think it's a sort of technology that we will start seeing problems solved that we thought were insolvable happen very quickly. So let's suppose we could wave a magic wand and the underlying rule for all of AI was identify systems that are inhumane, unjust, and unsustainable and help us make them humane, just, and sustainable. Just do that. Like, that would be our moral code. And our best minds who want to tackle a problem, whatever it is, have that at their fingertips. A country of 1 trillion geniuses that have that as their goal. It would be incredibly powerful. And, in terms of the framework, you've spent your life evolving, developing, testing, empirically proving. I would think hard around, wow, how can I be that force? That might be the most important question of the rest of your time on this planet, is how do I do that? Maybe everything you've done in your life to this point has prepared you for this moment.
I like that vision quite a bit. It's also making me wonder, should we just put AI on the task of addressing that catch-22 that we started this conversation off with about the rapid pace toward AI dominance and the dangers of that rapid pace? What would AI do if it were put on that task of solving that problem, that prisoner's dilemma?
I think it will be. The question is, will other people's AI do the same thing? You're starting to see that in cybersecurity as AI is being used for these new attack vectors, right, against us. Other AIs are being designed to head them off. And you're seeing this in open source software where AI agents are going through and find where are the security vulnerabilities. So I think that's sort of a micro example of how that can be done. The vast majority of the population, including the billionaires and trillionaires, want the world to be a better place. Everybody wants this to be used. It's sort of the few bad actors that have the ability to use this in a way that we don't want.
You know, thinking about people may want that. Their highest selves may want that. And we also know that people have other darker emotions that direct their behaviors, and fear is a big one, greed is a big one, myopia is another one. So we can want that and still have all these other forces at play because we're human beings. And how do we manage for those motivations?
Maybe just to step back a second, we're going to face this challenge that we've never faced in our history as a species. It's a good challenge, but it's still a challenge. And I do believe this is the third major change in terms of economically how our species thrives. The first was when we figured out how to farm, several thousand years ago. And a lot of our history has been around, and the tensions in our history has been around scarcity. So when we were hunter-gatherers, it was we fought over the best hunting ground. When it was agriculture, we fought over the best land with access to water, et cetera. In the industrial age, in the 20th century, we fought over energy, which initially was coal, British Empire, and then was oil in the 20th century, US. As our technology has evolved, scarcity has moved. This is going to be the first technology where we're going to have incredible abundance. And the issue isn't going to be how do you divide scarce resources? It's going to be how do you share the abundance? And it's a very different problem. And you would think, why is that a problem? But it's a problem because of the economic shift we're going to go through. Humans have adapted to this shift in scarcity to prosper. If you're educated or have some set of skills, you basically, we go to where there's scarcity, develop skills, and then charge a premium to do that. And the last 200 years, our global economy has built on what I call the expert model. It's evolved over the last 40 years, and we do this with our kids. It used to be finish high school and go get a job in a factory. Factories were automated. Then it became go to college, develop a narrow expertise that people will pay for, and you're going to live a good middle-class life. If you're really good at it, you'll be upper middle class. If you're a genius, you'll be the new aristocracy. Computer programmers, doctors, lawyers, et cetera. And a lot of the cost and friction in our global economy and why there are pockets of scarcity is because expertise has been expensive, sporadic in terms of its quality, and hard to get. Think of every problem we have, and it really comes down to that. Well, now expertise is going to be free, plentiful, and consistent. That takes huge costs out of the economy. If you define wealth as the ability to produce more and better and wider products and services at lower costs and get them to people, global wealth is going to go through the roof. And we've seen this with the internet. So I'll give you a great example. So over the last 30 years of the internet, we've created 80% of the wealth in the world. Hundreds of trillions of dollars. Ironically, we've reduced wealth inequality over the last 30 years. The Gini coefficient, when Netscape browser launched, was 0.7. Gini coefficient is a measure of wealth concentration or income distribution. 1 is bad, 0 is everybody has the same thing. So you want to be lower. When the Netscape browser launched, global inequality was at 0.7. It's now 0.61. It's dropped 14%. Despite billionaires and trillionaires, which people focus on, there just aren't that many of those people. Most of the middle class in the US that disappeared went to the upper middle class. That's actually what happened. Global poverty went from 40% to under 10%. So that was a good thing. And it was driven by this technology. Now, not everything was good about this technology, but in terms of wealth, it worked really well. Wealth we create, however you measure it with this technology, is going to be 10x that. Like everybody on the planet could be a millionaire, worth $1 million if we distribute it equally. So we're not going to have a limitation on that stuff. And everything will be more energy efficient delivered, use fewer resources, et cetera, because you can design that in. And frankly, it's cheaper to do that now. Like you're better off using less energy, less resources to deliver things. It just costs you less. There's fewer steps in the process. You don't have as many materials to pay for. And so I think that's all good. The problem we have is all those people that made their living as experts, that's gone. It's going to disappear. And as an example, the last 40 years, there's been a big premium on math skills. You don't even need to be a good person. Like you could have no personality at all. But if you had really good math skills, you're going to do really well in this world because that was valued at a premium. Value that's about to go to zero. What happens to all these people and how did they access that wealth creation in a way? And more importantly, how do you benefit the bottom 20% of the population in a way we couldn't do before? Bottom 40% of the population, which did not, in the United States, in the world, they benefited greatly from the internet revolution. The bottom 20% did incredibly well, but didn't in the developed world, like in our country and other countries. So that, to me, is a huge policy question of how we figure out how to distribute that. And that solves a lot of these other problems that we have, where people feel left out, not heard, not participating in the success of society and the global economy. If we solve that, we don't solve all the problems, but we solve a lot of them.
Okay, so I want to know how we do that, how we go about solving that problem. And I want to talk a little bit about energy because so much energy is required for this AI revolution. And where is that energy going to come from in a way that is completely sustainable and not destructive to the planet and to other species?
So I'll give you a little sense of perspective, like on how much energy is used. So let's say you're a typical consumer and you do 15 ChatGPT queries a day, you generate 10 images and you do 3 videos. Okay? That'd be a fairly active user today. That's the equivalent of driving your electric car about 10 miles, just so you can equate it. Now, electric cars have put huge pressure on the grid. And I think if anything, there's 2 aspects to AI. There's what's called training and inference. Training is you're training the model. You do that once, and then inference is we all use it. Most of the energy today historically has been going to training, and that's going to reduce to inference over time. Inference uses a lot less energy per query, but there's a lot more people doing it. First, on the good news front, the beginning of chips optimizing inference for energy has just begun. So even the generation of chips next year that come out will probably be anywhere from 10 to 50 times more efficient from an energy standpoint. We're just getting better at it, and that'll continue. The flip side, inference usage is going up like 1,000 times a year. So we do have to solve the energy problem. I'm in a project right now with a major construction project in Arizona, and power is a huge deal. To me, the only long-term solution is nuclear, unless we figure out how to put the data centers in space, and then it's solar. Solar and wind just don't scale enough to supply that amount of power on a consistent basis. The good news is we're making huge strides in nuclear, but personally, I think that's probably the best long-term solution.
And what about the dangers of nuclear and also all of the rare earth minerals that we're going to need for all of this technology? So it's not just energy, it's also ores and minerals.
Yeah, I mean, those things are going to be, required mostly in our devices, less in the data center side of it. That's happening anyway. I don't think that's being driven as much by AI. It's just being driven by the fact that more people are using more consumer devices. Because whether it's an AI chip or a regular chip, it's sort of, the same thing from that standpoint.
Or batteries in electric vehicles. And if we electrify everything and we need batteries and we need these rare earth minerals, we're just going to need more of them.
Yeah, and I think that's probably why nuclear is a better solution, because you do need less of them versus solar or wind, in terms of that solution. But yeah, I mean, I wish I was smart enough to answer that question, but we've got to find more efficient ways. There's plenty of rare earth materials. The issue is processing them is very damaging. It's a very tough process, and 90% of it's done in China today.
And the issue of nuclear waste, even if we can make really safe nuclear reactors, we still have to dispose of the waste?
Yeah, the waste for nuclear is far less than the waste from, almost any other energy source. If you put it on the scale of the planet, I think you could store all of the nuclear waste ever produced in a shockingly small area. You just don't, it's actually physically not that big. Personally, my long-term bet is we just shoot it into space. If that's a solution, because the cost of space travel is reducing so much, you would just take it off planet if you really had to do that. You could also pretty safely store it here as well. It's much less economic harm than a strip mine, a coal mine, or how we store. The bigger issue to me is how do you store all the electronic waste, as you talked about, from the batteries, iPhones, and everything else. I think that's a much bigger problem than storing nuclear waste. In terms of the safety, somebody once said to me, realize that the nuclear plants we have today were designed by computers that ran on vacuum tubes, a lot of it. Because we really hadn't had much innovation in nuclear because it had been regulated out of existence for the most part. So there was no incentive for innovation there other than by a couple companies. That's changed, and there are a number of nuclear projects that using sort of more modern technology that are far safer. The reality is the world needs energy. Like you can become more efficient, but you can't lift people out of poverty without energy. It's just, that's just the way it is. So you have to find the path of least harm in terms of producing that energy in the most efficient way so it lifts people out of poverty. My bet is nuclear is probably that answer.
So, you know that the foundational principle that undergirds the solutionary framework is doing the most good and the least harm. So I recognize that we can't do all good and no harm, but we can do more good and less harm, and ideally the most good and the least harm. So let's get back to that question of how do we distribute this wealth so that coefficient goes down even more and we really have a more equitable society. I think I'm going to ask this question in the context of Elon Musk, who used to warn about AI as potentially more dangerous than nuclear weapons. And now he's running an AI company and he's talking about AI as the savior of humanity and going to usher in an amazingly abundant sort of Star Trek future. But you talked about that too, that better future. So how exactly do we change the political and economic systems for such a future? Can you paint a picture of what that future looks like?
Yeah, well, I think it goes one of two ways. Every prior technology that we've adopted has destroyed jobs and created jobs. And every time it created a lot more jobs than it destroyed, and the jobs were much higher paying. So that's been our history. On this technology, people honestly don't know. I lived in San Francisco. My belief is that startups in the Bay Area are the canary in the coal mine of what's going to happen, right? So you're starting to see this in these startups. They have fewer people, but they're really highly productive. There's also 10 times as many startups because this technology allows you to start companies much more cheaply. That in turn creates a lot of primary, secondary, and tertiary jobs that pay really well. So that could happen. I don't know. I'm not smart enough to answer that question, and nobody really knows. But I don't think we can bet on that. I think we have to sort of bet on the alternative, that it's going to be significant job destruction. I mean, you saw I don't know if you saw the headlines today, but we lost 92,000 jobs in the United States in a strong economy, right? And I have to believe some of that is a result of AI. In that situation, I think we will figure out policies because we're a democracy, and democracies are pretty good at that, in the long run, very bad at it in the short run. We did it in prior ages. We had this situation in the 1890s, early 20th century, where a few people controlled the economy, and basically capitalism, it created significant wealth, but was very bad at distributing it. And three types of governments emerged to deal with that. We had communism, fascism, and then liberal democracy. And if you had to vote at that point, liberal democracy was a distant third, because the other two systems were much more efficient at distributing wealth than liberal democracy. We ended up in 2 world wars. Liberal democracy won. Why? Because we had brilliant people that adjusted our society to distribute wealth. We allowed unions. We had Social Security. We started Medicare. We had civil rights. All those things were designed to take the abundance and try to distribute it while not killing the golden goose, which is innovation. And this is an important idea because we all know, like, it's known how you need to design your economy to build wealth. It's known. Like in countries that have very poor population, they just don't implement those policies for whatever reason. Rule of law, respect for private property, consistent regulation, whatever that is, et cetera, education system. But the one thing you do need, which is you need to over-reward innovation, particularly in a world that's changing so fast. There were two countries in the last 30 years that over-rewarded innovation, China and the US. As a result, China and the US now dominate the global economy. So if you fast forward 30 years, you still need to over-reward innovation in your society. But at the same time, you've got to distribute the wealth that's in everybody's best interest. We don't have the equivalent yet today of unionized Social Security, Medicare, civil rights that we had then to allow us to shift. We need to figure it out. People are talking about universal basic income, and maybe we do need to do that. In California, we're looking at a billionaire tax. Not a bad idea. So we have to find a way to get that wealth for it not to be so concentrated and get it to the rest of the population. Now, the good news is there's going to be so much of it, I think it becomes an easier problem. And even the people with this wealth, and I know a lot of them, they agree, you have to distribute this. You have to take care of some of these problems. People have to have their basic needs dealt with: housing, medical care, education, et cetera. Now, all those things will get a lot cheaper because of AI, which should also make them more accessible. So the problem does get easier to solve, but I can't say anybody's figured out the mechanisms yet to say, we do these three things, we're fine. But I think maybe that's where we direct the AI. Maybe that's where the solutionary framework comes in, right? Because this is complex. How do you reward innovation? How do you give people meaning? How do you make sure their needs are met, make them feel part of it? It's a complex problem, and we need thinkers like we had John Maynard Keynes in the last century that figured out, hey, if we adjust the economy this way, we could be in much better shape. And you had leaders like Franklin Roosevelt, who was smart enough to implement these policies for the most part. Do we have these leaders today? That's probably a whole nother podcast if you just look around the world. The one difference is we're going to have a lot of abundance to distribute. And that does make this easier.
I don't want to neglect the risks of AI. You've given us the positives. Can you give us one example of how this could play out very badly?
I can talk about how it'll play out, I think, one example. So, in North Korea today, I'm making it up, there might be 10 or 20,000 people trained in North Korea that call out with the sole purpose of trying to steal your money. And you get these calls or emails you respond to. Well, my bet is North Korea has taken out of those 20, 30,000 people, their best 50 or 100, and training an AI bot on their best practices and skills. Then they're going to replicate that 9 billion times. Every human on the planet has a bot whose sole purpose is to steal your money or your identity or whatever. Now, on the flip side, the cybersecurity companies will do the same thing. They'll take their absolute best security techniques, train a bot on that, replicate that 9 billion times, and every person, there'll be a Zobot whose sole purpose is to keep people from stealing your money, identity, etc. Those two bots will fight it out in this agentic world, unbeknownst to us, one trying to protect us, one trying to harm us. I think, that's the dynamic that is going to occur as you have threat protection, in all these different areas.
So when I hear you speak on the techno-optimism, techno-pessimism scale, it sounds like you generally fall on the techno-optimism scale. Am I interpreting that correctly?
Yes, with caveats, but yes.
Okay, so last summer, I was in the audience when you gave a short talk about the potential for AI to be a true game changer for humanity. And toward the end, your voice cracked, your eyes watered, despite the positive picture that you were painting for us. Why?
I think the transition is going to be very difficult for a few reasons. I think we're going to go through radical social and economic displacement. Societies become destabilized when you have an overabundance of elites. People think that when we have revolution, it's the poor rising up. It really isn't. It's usually educated elites that don't have access to power, status, and money, right? Because think about it. You go to school, you go to get a PhD, or you're some elite. You've worked really hard. You've paid your dues, and you're working in some dead-end job, or you can't even get a job. Example, college graduates today, right? You're stuck with student loans. It's going to make you pretty angry. There's a reason the person who was elected mayor of New York was elected. You could agree or disagree with his approach, but he touched something. And that's when societies become unstable. And that's a little bit of the canary in the coal mine, because we could be in a situation where 80% of the elites in this country are in that situation. That's highly, highly destabilizing. The other area that worries me is we're meaning-seeking beasts, right? We're a meaning-seeking species. So we will go find meaning wherever it is. And some of the dark things, we talked a little bit about on the internet, isn't people that are necessarily bad, but they found bad places to find meaning and purpose. Our society is built on you get meaning and purpose from what you do. Like, how do you introduce yourself? Or has anybody introduced themselves? I'm a lawyer, I'm a doctor, I run a nonprofit. That's your sense of meaning and purpose. That's going to go away for a lot of people. So where do they go find their meaning and purpose? Is it going to be to the light or to the dark? If we can steer it to the light, God, what does that do for humanity? What it does to the arts, what it does, how we interact with people. So that's my techno-optimist side. It frees us up. I live in a community that a lot of people here are retired. They've done well. They don't really have money needs. They don't really have work. They're more fulfilled than they've ever been in their lives because they can pursue things they've always wanted to pursue. They can, have a band or a book club or work for a nonprofit and sort of drive change because they weren't in a position to do it before. They have intense meaning. So part of my techno-optimism could be, should we make people wait to be 60 years old and be successful in life to do that? Why can't we let them do that much, much earlier? And we're going to unleash billions of people that live like affluent, highly educated, intelligent 65-year-olds, right? That's my techno-optimist side. We need to steer things towards that.
So even using that word elite implies that they're a small percentage of the population. The vast majority of the population, that's not who we're talking about. What is their future?
If you look at what makes the elite, particularly after they've stopped working, it's because they have financial resources that they can pursue the things they want. And just if you do the math, there'll be a lot more of those people, and they can do it at a younger age. So, if you find a way to distribute this wealth, you're just going to have more people that bottom 20% is going to get shifted up. All the quintiles will get shifted up. And I think what's hard to get our head wrapped around is because we live day to day, change happens very slowly, right? If we're sitting here 30 years from now, 95% of the wealth in the world will have been created during that period. And I don't necessarily mean wealth like a lot of money. I mean wealth in terms of the ability to have access to products, services, housing, healthcare, all that is going to be 20x what it is today. That solves a lot of problems. Because we created so much wealth the last 30 years, we pulled over 30% of the world population out of poverty. So this is going to be 20x that. And our global population is not growing that fast. And, one of the big drivers of becoming, quote, the elite, besides financial resources, is education. And AI is going to unleash an education revolution for people that desire to be educated. It's going to completely change the game. And I've spent a lot of time in high-tech education in the last 40 years in terms of companies that have provided education. And so I have, pretty deep knowledge of that area. And I don't think people understand how profound a shift is going to be globally for any human that wants to learn a subject. They're going to learn it 10 times faster and know it 10 times better and go 10 times deeper in whatever their interest is. And AI is going to enable all of that. And AI will enable you to learn the way you want to learn in real time. We're starting to see systems that do that now. That, combined with resources that are available, I think allow everybody to be that elite if they want to be. I really do. They may decide not to be for whatever reason, either conscious or subconscious, but they will have that option, I think, in another 30 years.
Back to the prisoner's dilemma and the reality that we are in this catch-22 with speed and safety. Is there anything that you can suggest to the audience to be part of the process of ensuring that AI leads to greater good and not greater harm? Like the ordinary person listening to you, what can that person do?
Seek out younger politicians that get this, that aren't prescribing 20th century solutions to these problems, because those 20th century solutions won't work. You know, people that really get it. If we got behind politicians that really understood this, were really proactive, and they had the money to get elected, we could drive real change, because there are things we can do. You know, the U.S. issue is China. Like if the argument is, which has a lot of validity, if we do this, China won't, and we'll fall behind, which is not good, right? And the Chinese are saying the same thing. Where there are areas we can regulate and drive safety that have nothing to do with the prisoner's dilemma, which will solve the prisoner's dilemma at the company level effectively.
Did you just mean there, if we don't do it, China will? You said if we do it, China won't?
What I'm saying is that one of the reasons the U.S. argues we can't put restrictions on AI is because China isn't putting restrictions on it. And if we put restrictions on it, we're going to fall behind. I'll give you one simple example, maybe to illustrate it. So one of the issues with AI is, I don't even know your Zoe. You could be like some North Korean AI bot that sent me an email to do a podcast, and, you know, we're doing this, but I don't know that's you. And this idea of provenance, or that article you read from the New York Times, do I even know that's from the New York Times? That's a very solvable problem with crypto and encryption. So if we regulated a standard that allowed validated identity of a person or a thing, that would solve a lot of problems. And think about that. You would have a Zoe identity that you could secure as tightly as you want. You know, to verify it's you got to get the face, the thumbprint, the voice, and your password. Okay, that's pretty good. And so I will know when you come on, oh, this is Zoe. Or a post you made, Zoe wrote that. That's an easy problem to solve with the right regulation. And that would solve, when you look at the threats out there, that solves a lot of them.
Given how fast this is all moving, and given the fact that the vast majority of us don't understand these intricacies and complexities, how does the ordinary person, the ordinary audience member here, ascertain that a certain candidate really gets it and is really going to be part of the solution for the legislative and policy-making aspects that need to be addressed, and need to be addressed constantly because of how rapidly this is moving? You know, it's not as if a law that might be passed today is going to be the right law a year from now, or even 6 months from now. So how do we identify those people?
I think you find politicians that can clearly articulate the risks, but don't pander to you. Like they can articulate the balance between, you know, our national interests, our societal interests, and also how do you deal with the risks around this. And that frankly happened in crypto pretty well, right? I've always been skeptical of government's ability to do things intelligently, but this was an example where I think they did it really well. And they did it quietly outside the press. They did it in closed rooms. They did it, you know, very thoughtfully. So I think you find people that can articulate that, you know, clarity around the risks, clarity around the solutions that aren't just pandering to you, that sort of balance some of this complexity and aren't, you know, in front of cameras 18 hours a day, getting themselves on, you know, Instagram or television or whatever people use now to, you know, get out there.
So, Doug, you talked about how math skills are going to be devalued. What are the skills that we most need right now?
Well, I think the skills that'll be valued will shift. I think it'll shift to, and a lot of it centers around trust, because the vast majority of people for the things they do in life are not going to delegate their entire life to AI. They want a person to talk to. Pick your area. Could be law, medicine. It's still going to be a human for 99% of the population. That human is going to be very adept at leveraging AI to give the best advice. So I think, but that human is also going to be somebody you can trust. Ironically, the things that I think were devalued the last 30 years because of the importance of the STEM skills will now become more important than ever. And it centers around your personal brand, which is really an external projection of who you are as a person. It's going to center around trust. It's going to center around a certain bit of savviness of using these tools so you can deliver your advice or your service in a very effective way that the person trusts that what you're delivering is in their best interest. And it will be a world where, because of the speed at which it moves, if you violate that trust, it'll go away very fast. That becomes critically important. And the human skills become critically important. The liberal arts skills become critically important.
Did you really say the liberal arts skills? As I recall, back in 1979, you thought that my trajectory in the liberal arts world was maybe not as important as yours.
I would question that memory because I was very interested in liberal arts, but I worked in the steel mills to pay for school, so I needed to have an economic future. No, I've always valued the liberal arts. Unfortunately, they've been devalued by society as a result of our economic model the last 40 years. I think they become very important because humans are going to have to go back to being humans, not computing machines, right? They're going to have to go back to, the ability to have depth, understanding, they have meaning in their lives that they can impart to provide meaning in other people's lives, right? That becomes critically important, and AI won't replace that. So, and all built around the idea of you're somebody I can trust. Those people are going to flourish. If you have those skills and you're adept at using the tools, you are going to flourish in this world. Now, the key is how do we get 9 billion people in that position? And then, I'm very optimistic for the future of humanity.
I really love that. And I really was just giving you shit because the truth is you have spent a lot of time reading and exploring the canon in the liberal arts, whereas I have spent no time learning anything about engineering and very little about business. So the truth is that you were much more interested in what I was interested in than I was.
You must admit, I've spent a lot of time in your world, and and I've always invited you to mine. That's not true, actually. When I met you, you were one of the first true Trekkies I'd ever met. You were very interested in technology. So I don't think you're giving yourself enough credit. I think you were much more in tune with it than you give yourself credit for.
That's probably true. And, it's, probably a little of both is why we've been such good friends for so many years.
Why did we connect? I was the first engineer you met at Penn.
I know. And, you got me on the crew team to be a coxswain for all of 5 minutes because I was so small. You thought you'll be perfect for this, but I didn't last.
Well, you were the one person on the team that could count to 10. That was really an important skill as well.
All right. My last question for you, Doug. What would you like your epitaph to be?
He left the world a little bit more humane and just than he entered it.
I love that. And you know what? It's almost like my epitaph. So here we are, kind of like the same person in different sizes.
Well, we've lived 40 lives together, so that's not surprising.
Thank you so much for this. This was really great. I'm definitely going to want to have you back on the podcast.
Great. So loved it. It was great. Always great seeing you, and really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Solutionary Voices. I hope you enjoyed it, that you'll share it, give us a review, and please do subscribe. And if you would like to be a solutionary yourself and employ the solutionary framework that Doug mentioned to problems that you care about, I invite you to read my book, The Solutionary Way. Thanks so much.